Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the special event for the 15th anniversary of the India Policy Forum. We started 15 years back with the idea of fostering economic research of a high quality, empirically sound, and evidence-based on India. And it's a testimony to our lasting power that we have done well in these 15 years. And I, as the Director General of the National Council of Applied Economic Research, am very privileged to be here in front of us. We're also privileged because we have the Chief Economic Advisor of India to the Government of India, Arvind Subramanian, with us. And we're going to have a scintillating evening in conversation with him. And in conversation with him is going to be my co-conspirator, Karthik Muralidharan. Let me introduce both of them. Arvind, of course, as the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, has transformed his office. And the clearest manifestation of that has been the work he has done on the economic survey. He's too well known for me to give you a detailed bio, so I'll just repeat what his boss, the Finance Minister, Shri Arun Jaitley, had to say about him. Mr. Jaitley said, "I will miss his dynamism, energy, intellectual ability, and ideas. He would walk into my room at times, several times a day, addressing me as minister." I'm not sure whether it was yes minister or no minister, but addressing me as minister to give either the good news or otherwise. His departure will be missed by me, and I know that his heart is still very much here. That's the same sort of feeling we had when we first heard that Arvind is going to be leaving. Karthik Muralidharan, of course, is the co-editor of the India Policy Forum, my co-editor, and also the Tata Chancellor's Chair Professor of Economics at the University of California in San Diego. We're very privileged to have him. We are privileged to have him also because they had a similar conversation in 2015 when Arvind was just a year into his job. So today we are going to have the after, and if you go back to 2015 and watch the video that they did then, you'll have the before. So we're going to have a before and after evening. Please join me in welcoming Arvind Subramanian to this evening, and we are looking forward very much to a very scintillating performance. Thank you, Arvind. Thank you, Karthik.
Shekhar, it's truly an unexpected pleasure to be doing this. I think it's been a bonanza IPF now as a co-conspirator and co-editor with Shekhar of this forum. We had a wonderful talk by N.K. Singh on the 15th Finance Commission 3 days ago. We had 2 days ago, we had Professor Dixit yesterday, and we get to conclude now this with this discussion with Arvind. So I think in the spirit of the previous discussions we've had, I think the goal here is much more to kind of really just have an informed public discussion of what are very complex political economy issues. And I think what would be great is just to start with an overview of just what you consider the highs, the greatest kind of positive achievements, both of the government and of yourself in kind of the past 3 years. When you sit back and you reflect on this time, what are the things you're happiest about?
Yeah, I think that it's a good distinction to draw between what the government has done and what, and also when you start talking about achievements, there's a if I start listing things, then it sounds like everything that happened was because of me, which is not the case, of course. But I think certainly in terms of the government, I would kind of highlight 3 or 4 big things. I think first and foremost, I would say that the goods and services tax, which was a absolutely transformational landmark piece of legislation. I mean, we can talk about that later, but I just want to give you a sense of 29 plus 7 plus 1 quasi-sovereign entities coming together, giving up or pooling their sovereignty, at a time when you see the reverse happening all over the world. I mean, that's something quite incredible that happened. And of course, many things good about the GST. Still, it's a work in progress in some respects. But I think this is the first truly effective and operational institution of cooperative federalism in India, where genuinely important decisions get taken by, all collectively. So GST is a major achievement. I think the second thing I would highlight is, we've spoken a lot about, and in the survey we've written a lot about, the problem of exit in India, which, probably happens everywhere, but I think it's been particularly difficult in India, especially in the context of the twin balance sheet challenge. So I think the fact that the bankruptcy code was enacted, I think that we've seen the first two, maybe one more case out of the 12 has been successfully gone through resolution. So we're seeing exit from a very difficult political situation happen for the first time. It's not perfect. I think we still have ways to go on this. But having a legal framework for the first time that facilitates and actually exit happens, I think that's quite special. The other thing, of course, I think the government has been very careful about maintaining macro stability. And I think, for example, even now, when there are lots of pressures to be more populist on oil prices, I think the government has, to its great credit, I think, stuck to the path of fiscal consolidation and stability. But the fourth point, I think, and this is a little bit my own kind of take on how I see, if you want to kind of discern some kind of underlying pattern or kind of idea or ideology, is that I think the one, and this is something that I think the Prime Minister has been very keen on, is basically to use whatever technology, JAM, etc., and all those things, to better provide so public provision, not of public goods like health and education, where I think we're still lagging way behind, but the public provision of essential private goods and services, especially to the more deserving. So if you, again, I don't want to get into how effective, what you should monitor, etc., but as an idea and as something that is vigorously pushed, toilets, bank accounts, housing, power, Ujjwala, most important, Ujjwala. So it's the public provision, not of public goods, but the public provision of essential private goods. And in some sense, if you wanted to kind of, attribute kind of, intent and thought behind this, I think it is a way of trying to say that, we can improve state capacity, and we're doing it for this particular purpose. So I think it's a kind of welfareism which is going out of subsidies and more towards this provision of essential private goods and services. So those, I think, 3 or 4 things would be, I think the big, something that I would take back as achievements of the government in these last 4 years. Now, on a more personal level, I mean it when I say that, it's been a 24/7 high. It's like every day has been. But in terms of what I would look back upon, I think having played a role in forging the political consensus for the GST, I think in policy terms that was very, very satisfying. I wrote this report, which then fed into the political debate on what the rate should be and what the structure should be. I think that was very satisfying, very gratifying. I think that the early diagnosis of the twin balance sheet challenge and the public investment strategy, which we certainly had in the first 2 budgets, I think that was it. And then, of course, the economic survey has been such an exciting place for developing ideas, whatever. And as you know, the survey is, reasonably well read now. It's now part of almost every university curriculum. And then, of course, the team building that has gone into, and we'll touch upon this in this, that's gone into that, I would say, have also been extremely satisfying. I think in terms of, both ideas and concepts, very, people who've contributed to actually spoken first about, universal basic income. So I think 3 or 4 concepts that I think we've brought raised the profile of universal basic income. Vijay, Pranab, and all here, they've been the original kind of proponents of this. But raising its profile in the political debate, I think that's been very useful. I think JAM, the whole conceptualization of what can happen, and more, I am very more sympathetic to this idea that I've kind of tried to, peddle, or which I actually very much believe in, is this whole how stigmatized capitalism has become such a key kind of, or it's almost like what's the word for it, a phenomenon, or just this pall hanging over the public policy ecosphere, and how that's actually shaped all the good and the decisions we haven't made, which we're going to talk about, exit, 4C, privatization, so many things. I think just throwing that idea, stigmatized capitalism also. And of course, I think, working with, the Indian Economic Service, trying to build capacity, that's also been very useful. So, I don't want to go on because it starts sounding, that everything has happened because of me, but really, it's been, supremely satisfying. I know I'm going to have withdrawal symptoms. I'm already having them to get away from this. I think that would be
And so when you look back, and so that was great. I think, so is it fair to say that to the extent that there is an economic philosophy of this government, that a unifying theme, not necessarily expressed in so many terms, has kind of been a push towards formalization in various forms? Whether it's through the GST, through various aspects of using Aadhaar to kind of clean up benefits, and that there is an inevitable process of pain with some gain. And so, A, do you think that's a fair characterization overall? And then do you have a sense of how you would quantify the costs and benefits of how that process has worked out?
See, I think that, I would say that, two broad ideas. One would be, formalization is one. And I think this whole thing about using state capacity, a different notion of welfareism, as it were. I think these would be twin kind of deeper thoughts underlying, or philosophies or visions underlying what the government's done. On informalization, yes, it's a I don't know, you're being kind to me. Of course, obviously demonetization was also, aimed at that. So I think a series of things were done on trying to formalize the economy. How has it gone? I think, of course, we'll have to see. I know the GST better than other areas. For all the challenges that remain ahead of the GST, if you look at the early data on the GST, I am extremely encouraged by how much voluntary, at least registration, has taken place. So just to give you two numbers, for example, and Kapil will correct me if I'm wrong, that I think there was something like 1.9 or 2 lakh of enterprises that did not have to register, that were below the threshold, that nevertheless chose to register, right? Similarly, I think more than 50% of the firms that could have just registered under what we call the simpler composition scheme, you just pay like a turnover tax, less requirements, disclosure requirements, form filling, but more than 50% actually chose, of those who were eligible, actually chose to register under the formal GST. Professor Indira Raman has always made the point that, the costs that were imposed on the GST stemmed from the fact that the big guy would want to buy from the small guy, and therefore they would have to formalize, which would impose a cost. You get the formalization benefit in the long run, but you pay the short-term cost you pay the transition. But what we discovered in the data, which is really interesting, is that a lot of small guys actually buy from the big guys. So they want so it's not just formalization forced because otherwise you can't supply, but also because you buy so much and you want to avail yourself of input tax credit because you're buying from that, you also register as well. So I think on formalization, and of course, the first revenue numbers that have come in have actually surpassed my expectations wildly. We've seen some increase in personal income taxes, which I think we do some analysis. It's post-demonetization in GST. We don't know how long it will last, jury's out. But also on the GST collection itself, I think we're seeing a kind of buoyancy that's never been seen before. We've seen, for example, virtually, if you look at the system as a whole, virtually no compensation requirements required. So I think from all these senses, I think that at least the GST in terms of formalization has not been too bad for the first year of difficult implementation. Now, there are, of course, other aspects of formalization. I think that there is a sense in which, for example, tax administration has not, on the income tax side, corporate tax side, needs to become more tax friendly, and I think maybe to some extent more can be done. But certainly on these narrow, at least the GST side, I sense that. Now on the other, which is the other thing, I think also, if you look at, for example, there's some the recent report done by the Omidyar Foundation, for example. We've also done some work here. That Aadhaar has also had, and the delivery of benefits has, has been improved and made thing by all this. So I think there's been, but overall, I don't have a good sense of, how this is going to go going forward. Whether, we've struck, and the balance between, my own view is that, of course, the more, and probably this is what Professor Dixit also has been saying. I think he wrote a very nice piece a little while ago on this. I think the more you rely on carrots and the less you rely on sticks, I think it's probably going to be, you're going to, I think, facilitate formalization better that way. And I think that's why I like the GST. It's not heavy-handed, it's kind of self-policing, and I think, therefore, I think it's, and of course, we're going to see some benefits on the income tax side going forward, because once you have all this data, you can match and see, and I think that's going to be quite positive as well.
Great. I guess I'll jump around a little bit, because I think, so when you mention taxes, so talking to business, I mean, I think, the sense you get certainly is that tax harassment, for what it's worth, like, just the bogey of the tax man, I mean, has certainly all the small, medium businessmen do talk about. Now, the problem is there's a two-sided view on this, right? One is that the government would say the official view is that these are just people who weren't in the tax net and who are complaining, and so this is just part of the inevitable pain of formalization. But we also know that part of this process automatically just gives more discretionary power, like, to the lower level tax inspectors. So,
this being what? This being?
This being this push towards formalization.
Okay, yeah.
And so
Correct.
there's just more choke points at which people can now be kind of caught in some compliance net of some sort, right? And so sitting as a system designer, right? What kind of principles would you put in place to just balance those two trade-offs? Because at one level, if the squeaking is because these are people who should be brought in, like, that squeaking we have to live with. But to the extent that that squeaking is also reflecting genuine harassment, that's feedback you will get. But how do you decide whether you want to react to that feedback because it's a real problem? So there's a data side of the argument, of the question. And then there's a system design part of the question, which is this classic type 1, type 2 error, and how we deal with that.
A very good question, Karthik. I think that certainly for me, rule number one, principle number one, is that, tax administration in countries like ours, or rather, tax policy is almost half of tax administration, right?
Tax administration.
Or the other way around,
Exactly.
whichever way. Tax administration, I don't know.
Is
Essentially, what I'm saying is that you need a fairly simple
implementation,
simple policy. For example, fewer rates, wider base, fewer exemptions. I think those principles are absolutely, I think fundamental in that. And I think on the GST, therefore, it's kind of a work in progress on that. I think we need to simplify that a little bit more. On the direct tax side, I think we are, Arvind Modi is heading a committee where, again, I hope some of these principles will be adopted, where we have much simpler tax structures, and that's one. The second principle, I would, and this kind of relates, and maybe we can come back to that, I do think that, for example, when you have fiscal targets, I think this having targets and having to meet them, I think it's something that does give rise to
Perverse incentives.
Perverse incentives, and I think that's something that I think we need to watch out for. You see, but the third principle I would say is essentially, which I laid out, is really try and use more, incentives rather than punitive actions to this. The problem, of course, is that when you have stigmatized capitalism, right? When you have stigmatized capitalism, you, in a sense, almost have to go overboard in order to establish the legitimacy of the state, to say, look, we are, even holier or better than that in going after the bad guys, right? I think that's just a legacy of stigmatized capitalism. And I don't know whether, in doing that, how you can actually minimize the collateral benefit in that. I think
the damage, or minimize the damage.
Yeah, minimize damage is going to be very difficult. So, so simplicity of policy and rules, more incentives, fewer kind of, targets that have to be met. And I think these would be my kind of broader underlying principles for this, yeah.
Yeah. So I think, there's obviously discussions to be had about work yet to be done, but maybe we'll save that for later. I thought what would also be useful is as you kind of demit office and think about the 9 months ahead, which I think there's many reasons to think that there's both global risks outside our control and the trade wars and oil, and then just political risks. It mean that, an election cycle will inevitably lead to pressures for perhaps, different kinds of unsound policies. So, what do you see as the biggest kind of challenges ahead, and just your broad recommendations for ways we should insulate/mitigate ourselves from both kind of global risk and potentially on the domestic side as well?
See, on the global risk, let's see, I think there are 3 or 4 big ones, right? One is oil prices, which have already gone up quite a bit. The second, I think, of course, is the whole dollar appreciating, capital outflows from all emerging markets. And the third, which I think is actually the one that probably I worry about the most, is, we've seen already the trade war mutating partly into a currency, not a war as yet. The trade war has become a war. The currency thing is a skirmish where, the Chinese currency has depreciated, and therefore all Asian currencies have depreciated, and therefore, and this is what I've said before, I think that to some extent, you cannot, prevent the consequences of this. So I think in terms of macro policy, you have to take some of the consequences that come from it. I mean, in the instruments that you have basically are, you take some currency adjustment, you prevent disruptive adjustment by using reserves, and then some countries like Indonesia have used monetary policy, to try and hold capital back and prevent this. Now, my own view is that I think that some of the currency decline that's happened is welcome. I mean, I don't want all the people in the media to say tomorrow I'm advocating it, which is what is that some of this is natural market adjustment, and just to tout IPF and Sajid's work, is that I do think that manufacturing exports in the last few years have not done as well as they should have. Manufacturing export to GDP has declined. And I do think that some of it has happened because real exchange appreciated by 20%. And I think, so that's something adjustment. And in terms of what we can do, I think that, ideally we should be having perhaps even tighter macro policy, because that's, remember, when you have shocks like this, you need to tighten, and you need to, what we call, Vijay would say this better than I would, expenditure reduction and expenditure switching, because we suffered a negative terms of trade shock. The expenditure switching is the currency adjustment. The expenditure reduction, you have some, slightly tighter monetary policy, which RBI has started, which I think is actually what the doctor would have ordered. And on fiscal policy, at least if we, don't tighten further, at least to hold the line so that we say, we are not going to add to these pressures. So it's kind of a Hippocratic norm, do no harm at least. And if we maintain that in this kind of difficult, and sensitive year, that would be one way of. And of course, I think that, remember that all these things have an exogenous element and a country-specific element. We don't control the former, we only control the latter. So on the ones that we do control, not adding to this macro prudence and stable fiscal prudence at this stage, and I think just, continuing finishing the reform agenda. For example, we said in the economic survey that for this year, we don't have to do, wildly ambitious new things. Maintain the stability, stabilize the GST, make more progress on the twin balance sheet, the resolution, and so on. And we also said, to be completely transparent, complete Air India, and well, let's see what we see on that. But I think if we can just hold to that agenda in this year, I think that would be actually a significant achievement.
Yeah. So let me ask you, where did the oil windfall go, right? Because, there's a part of this that says we were actually quite lucky in the past 3 years, with the falling global oil prices. I think government, to its credit, kind of didn't pass through. We talked about this last time. You got an effective implicit increase in the carbon tax. But, there wasn't any conscious escrowing of that surplus for some rainy day fund or paying down a debt or any specific project. So it clearly just supported the broader fisc. So, but if we had to so in a way, we were kind of not doing the counter-cyclical thing you would expect, because all that money got spent, right? Partly pay commission, partly other things. But if you just had to do a simple accounting exercise for the lay public that says, there was that oil windfall, where did it go? What would the answer be?
I think the oil windfall, I think, broadly went into deficit reduction, which is a kind of, I would say that's a kind of building, thing for the future. And, the public investment expansion that happened, and some other expenditures, like you said, the pay commission. So I think broadly, these were, the pay commission, it is what it is, you don't control that. But in terms of the use of money, I think deficit reduction and public investment increase, I think are not at all unreasonable ways of spending a windfall. Because, fiscal consolidation is a kind of buffer for the future. You gain reputation, therefore you can, when the rainy day comes, you could borrow more. Remember that, I think that, and I think, for full transparency, to kind of give an example of something that, a kind of battle that I lost. Remember that my own preference in the first 2 years would have been to go slower on the fiscal consolidation, because remember, we had the twin balance sheet challenge, private investment was down, macro was comfortable, we had large output gaps, and I was pushing much more strongly for more public investment, and more better spending. But that, I lost that battle because, maybe for very good reason, people felt that, the reputational gains from doing consolidation were greater. And so that's how the whole, that's how, so maybe in my view, maybe the balance between consolidation and public investment, I may have wanted a slightly different balance, but they're both, I think, eminently reasonable ways of spending a windfall.
Which is great. So I think, there's one thing which has been increasingly a concern. Now, this could be good, this could be bad, in the sense that you're starting to see a lot more off-balance sheet financing of special investments in infrastructure projects. Now, at one level, this is a good thing because, from, again, basic principles of public finance, you should do the project as long as the IRR is positive. The markets don't trust you, so ring-fencing that expenditure in a special purpose vehicle with the income allocated to paying off that debt could be a prudent way of kind of, both keeping your fisc and financing genuine development expenditure. The problem is, though, from an accounting perspective, this very quickly starts getting out of control because these are still implicitly government-backed investments. And so, two questions. One, do we have a full risk-adjusted accounting for what the true contingent liabilities may be, for those essentially off-balance sheet obligations? And this is also starting to happen at the state level in a substantial way.
So again, very perceptive question, Karthik. I think it's a really very important question as well. See, my own view is that we do I think our accounting is good and improving, but I don't think we present in a kind of consistent way, the whole consolidated public sector balance sheet. The UK has the PSBR, which is the really consolidated thing. I think we produce versions of this, but it's not kind of completely consistent, comprehensive in its coverage, and also consistent across time to enable you to do this. So I think that it's something that I have thought about. I think that one way forward would be which is something that, the NCAER FRBM committee, of which I was a part, and I dissented from vehemently on many aspects of that. But one thing we all were unanimously in favor of was a fiscal council. I think it was a fiscal council. I think it would be good to get, more independent, people out there doing this on a consistent basis with better access to data, so that you can, it's not that government keeps the data in government, and it's just, Professor Rajaraman is a big critic of how much we share and we don't share. But I think if we had something like that to make this, because I mean, your point is absolutely right. I think, it's no bad thing if we finance these projects, but I think people should have trust in government that, everything is properly accounted for, and that, everyone knows what's happening at any point in time and also across time. So I think certainly I would favor more effort in it, maybe via a fiscal council or some other mechanism that we can find.
So on a completely different note, since we had a paper in the environment, we had one last year on air pollution, one this year on climate change. And I think the general sense is that this will almost never be politically salient, except for that 1 month in November when suddenly Delhi can't breathe. So, so just an out-of-the-box thought, have we ever considered a green GNP kind of accounting exercise? That, this is not, again, it's something that Weitzman and Nordhaus and others have talked about, so it's not a new idea. But again, just to the extent that you want a composite measure of well-being and not kind of, GDP where you can't breathe, is that an idea that you've considered? Or what would you think about that? I
would a little bit take issue with what you said, because, I mean, on climate change at least, I mean, the Prime Minister's push to renewables, I think is responding to that challenge, very, very directly. If anything, I think that one could ask the question in India whether, the balance between renewables and thermal has overshot. Maybe has overshot. That's a question we need to think. But I don't think you can say that, this is only, it comes up once in a while. But I think that, but I do think transparency has to be one of the instruments for this. Now, another example is, I think that, it's not just, now I think 30 cities in India, you have to publish every day air quality, etc. I think that has a very, very important transparency as something, because I think the political economy does change when, when you measure something. Yeah. And so I think, in that, I would absolutely, yes, be in favor of a green GNP. My own idea, I have a smaller version of that idea. Is that, Professor Ramesh Chand is here. I think, for example, when we do the CACP does the costing, the MSP calculation, I think those costs should be social costs as well.
Absolutely.
When we, and this is something explicitly I've said, and Professor Ramesh Chand has also said, I mean, fertilizer should be valued at its social cost, not its similarly, water should be at its social cost. So I do think that we need much more transparency and this way of going, and green GNP would be a terrific thing to do as well.
So before I get into just the details of specific policies and stuff, I think one thing that would be useful just for a larger audience, including myself, is just to get some visibility into the process of how a CEA's office influences or is heard on various policy matters. So, obviously things that have budgetary implications come through the Ministry of Finance, where you kind of automatically have locus standi. But, what is the file flow, right? I mean, is kind of, is the CEA's inputs sought, is it proactive, is it reactive, is it automatic, where certain things automatically come?
I think it's a great question. It's something that, I wish, I mean, I would love to, write much more about. See, I think, Karthik, in all of this, and again, I don't want to, anything that I say, can come across as, I did it so well or I did it so badly. I don't want to stay clear of this. But I do think that all these things, there is a formal structure, and there is maybe an even more important informal structure, right? And for example, there is no need for, any file on policy that has to come to the chief economic advisor. Maybe there are some, maybe promotion of IES officers has to come to me formally, but I don't think it has to. I mean, so a lot depends upon, the informal networks that you build up. And let's be honest, it depends upon, the friends that you make, the enemies that you make. It depends upon people, how people think important you are in the system. So, for example, it's no secret that, I had a terrific relationship with the finance minister. So, in that, that, if the file doesn't come to me directly, I will go and gripe to the finance minister, and then he will show me the file. So, so there's all these informal processes at work. I think, and almost everything, see, remember that the CEA has, apart from having to produce a survey, has no real formal responsibility. This is just a kind of interloper in the system, who can be completely ignored or who can be very influential. I mean, so it really is a matter of, and I think therefore working with people, building bridges, building teams, building relationships, and then showing that you can add value. And Rakesh Mohan, when I was taking up this job, he said, Arvind, please make friends. Forget about the secretaries. Please make friends with all the joint secretaries and all of that. So I think a lot of it is informal. A lot of it is finally what you produce and deliver, and then either you can get into a kind of negative cycle where files don't come to you, you don't end up doing things, people don't think you're important and less files come to you, or you can build into a positive dynamic where you do stuff, you're proactive, people like what you do, and then you become suddenly seen as a player in the system, and then more files come to you. So, and it's not that, often I've had to fight for files coming to me with some of my colleagues, or go to the finance minister's office or to his personal assistant and say, this file is coming, I have to see this. Or just, complain to the finance minister, so.
No, so I think, I guess it's both encouraging and discouraging in the sense that, it's wonderful that you did what you did, but it's also concerning with regard to just, the institutional process by which, because if the CEA is not naturally in the flow of things, I guess, because the reason I'm asking you this is, I'm going to give you a laundry list of policies that a lot of, sensible economists would get rather riled up about. And so, the default question you often ask is, were they getting any economic input? Now, if they don't, right, so you can sit back and say, wait, the file didn't come. Or you can say, wait, you're not just in the finance ministry, you're chief economic advisor to the government of India. And so, there are spending decisions, there are policy decisions, there are procurement decisions, there are bans, there are regulations, and everything affects everything. And so, at some point, I do worry, right? When I think about, when I just see the lack of economic understanding in so many parts of our policy infrastructure, which just reacts in a very knee-jerk way to things with, say, price caps or quantity caps or regulation. This happens sector after sector, and we'll talk about more examples. And so, I guess two questions. One is maybe you just have to pick your battles and you kind of let a lot of these go because they're not really, there is no locus standi. But then there's another way of thinking about this, which is to say there is a need for deep economic kind of inputs into these processes. So at least there is a point raised that have you considered, for example, that capping, that a price cap has X, Y, Z consequences. And so,
see, but
how should we deal with that?
Yeah. I think you're asking two different questions, I think, Karthik. One is, don't we need more economic inputs into policy making, whatever? And, I don't think you can say necessarily that because kind of bad decisions get made, that they haven't got the economic inputs, or that they've not got the economic inputs from people other than the CEA. There are lots of other actors who are also providing inputs. And I would say that in many of these cases where you think it's not because advice wasn't given, it's despite advice being given. And despite, not me, but so many others in the system giving good advice on many of these things. So I think that, so I thought the second thing you were leading to was, therefore, in order to ensure that this happens, should there be some formal institutionalization of, that this must go through the CEA and stuff? I think that, to be fair to during the, I think the great
planning commission.
Yeah, no, for example, during the liberalization era, I think all chief economic advisors were, deeply involved in many of these policy decisions. Planning commission was involved in these decisions. So I think that I just don't feel that formalization is necessarily the way forward, because I mean there are ways of circumventing formalization. Someone says, "Oh, if I got to send you the file," and maybe you don't get the file on the way up, you get the file on the way down. When decisions have been taken. So I'm not sure that formalization is. You see, I think if I may push back a little bit at you, and given that my friend Devesh is here, I think we economists tend to always think in terms of formal rules and structures and equate that with state capacity, public institutions, and so on. Whereas I think there is this very amorphous, but I think no less important, whatever leaders, team builders, which frankly economists don't have a clue as to, and maybe it's actually by intrinsically the case. But I think that is a big part of, again, I think in that liberalization era, the fact that all these chief economic advisors, or many of them, so many of them, had similar backgrounds, had good relationships with each other, consulted a lot with each other. I think it was just that it was not because there was a formal CEA, but these people had this
institutional.
That's what got institutionalized, the networks and the relationships. And so
Exactly.
on.
And I'll come back at the end. We'll talk much more about building institutional capacity. I think I just wanted to get that out of the way, partly because I do want to now go through a set of specific policies, specific reforms, things that did happen, did not happen, and just figure out just how we got where we did, right? So I think we've already talked about GST. I think but so let me just give you 3 things, right, that have happened in the past year or 18 months that I think most economists really do worry a lot about, right? I think the first is the reintroduction of tariffs in this last budget. I mean, which really was quite worrying, right? I mean, a step back after 25 years of a broad consensus that we would kind of go to a non-differentiated kind of low tariff regime. And even somebody like Arvind Panagariya, who's always been like a very staunch supporter of most things the government has done, like did come out very firmly against that. And so, I worry about that, not just about the tariffs, but the political economy and what that entire can of worms it opens up. And maybe I'll just take this one at a time and let you respond to that.
Okay, on that, let me say 2 or 3 things. I think that Arvind is the trade economist and I'm not, and I think that Arvind expressed this view, which I think was shared amongst many economists, that this was did it signal, because remember there were 2 dimensions to this, right? One is the reversal, and the 2 is the selective reversal. Yeah, and that kind of opens up this. Is it rent seeking? Are some being favored? Others? So those questions were raised. But let me say 2 things, not in terms of exonerating this, but kind of the political economy, as you write. I mean, if you look at the products that were kind of targeted, I think there was a sense that those were targets coming from a large country from which we had a huge bilateral deficit. And remember, with this country, we not just have a large bilateral deficit, we have a very colonial pattern of trade where we export the raw materials, we get the final goods. So I think that that's a feature of the political economy that, we all know that bilateral deficits don't matter, it's whatever, we know all the theory, and every day now we get lessons on this because of what's happening elsewhere in the world. But I think that is the fact that many of these imports were coming from China, I think had some role to play in this. The other, I think, again, not exoneration, but just trying to understand, is that, look, everywhere in the world, within a domestic economy, there are impulses pro internationalization, there are interests and impulses against them. And policy is a result of this complex interaction between these and many other interest groups. And interests matter, but then the broader ecosphere of ideas also matters in kind of empowering some groups over others. And frankly, when the world is turning protectionist like this, it empowers those people within government who are within the country who are more. So, I mean, when you say, why are you doing this? Say, ye bhi kar rahe hain, wo bhi kar rahe hain, what's the big deal? So I'm not saying, again, that's exoneration or justification, but that's the way kind of it plays out in the political system. So I think that's why I think that you've seen some of those reversals happening. But I'm very much hoping that going forward that, these are things that hopefully will get, unrolled over time when, people see that, if we think it's not going to be effective as trade economists we think they are, then I think lessons will be learned and we will be, we'll act accordingly.
Right, but I think like Avinash Dixit mentioned, right, these mistakes have costs. These mistakes have costs, and even if you catch up eventually, say with China, right, there's like 7 years of lost GDP, even in that optimistic case, right? So I think, and it's such a difficult problem, right? Which is every one of these fights we lose. When I say we, as in the broader sense of what the right policy is, there is a genuine loss. And so I guess one way of asking the question is, when governments make mistakes, what are the feedback mechanisms they have, right? They listen, they read op-eds, but it's very hard for them sometimes to know when the criticism is motivated, when the criticism is genuine. So what would be like a quick feedback mechanism on this, right? If they made a mistake.
Yeah, let me give you an actual real world example, right? Actually, it happened. It's no secret that, I was not in favor of the 28% GST rate.
Right. Which was my next point.
Yeah, it's just so, and we had a GST 28% with a lot of the base in that 28%. But to me, what was really heartening was, last year in Guwahati, a consequence of lots of things, the complications that it led to, the penalties it imposed on especially some of the small traders, generally the cost of that being aware, the difficult compliance requirements. When that feedback started coming, I think the system responded very well, and the 28% rate, the base that was there, the number of items, came down quite dramatically. So I think the system has the ability to respond. In the case of the trade thing, right, I'm still, we do these costs of trade, welfare costs of trade calculations. I still haven't, to be honest, I still haven't seen the costs being felt in the system. So to be fair, I think let's say that, we haven't seen the costs yet, and that's why I said, if and when these costs become evident, I think there will be.
No, exactly.
Yeah. So for example, I think in this particular case, supposing some tariff was taken in order to promote, say, cell phone production or whatever, right? Now, supposing in fact actually domestic manufacturing of cell phones does go up, then what do? It's still costly, but from a narrow kind of political calculation, it's worked. And then I don't know what we should do. I really don't know what we should do.
Exactly, and I think, that's where the economic principles come in, partly because we know that at small tariff rates, the Habakkuk triangles are small, and you're not really, it's not that big a deal, but what we're not seeing is the cost of the contestation and the political economy that unleashes, because now you have let the genie out of the bottle, that this is now contestable, and then putting it in that murky realm of political economy. And so those are costs that are just not seen.
No, right? but I think to be fair, I think supposing, in the next budget and the budget after that, we got more pressures for tariff increases and therefore more giving in, I think then is when your costs of lack of contestation will become evident. I know, Professor Dixit is here. I think that one of the hardest ideas to sell in domestic politics is it's not even that not even that tariffs are costly. It's thing. I think the very subtle point that import taxes are also export taxes. I think that's Abba-Lerner symmetry, if I'm not wrong. That notion to impress upon anyone is, I think, politically, communicationally for an economist is almost impossible to do. People understand that if you rate tariffs on inputs, it imposes a cost. But the notion that raising broader tariffs leads to resources being drawn away from exporting industries is something that, it's too general equilibrium, happens too much, over time, too diffuse over time. It's just very hard to convey.
Yeah. So I think
that is a genuine problem. I think it happens also all over the world.
Exactly. Yeah. No, and I agree, right? And in a way, I guess the US partly solved this problem by kind of fast-track authority to the president, which is now backfiring, and Congress wants the power back. So, this is universally a hard problem. So the second on my list, which you already talked about, was GST. And we kind of, again, know that this 5-tier thing, is just, it's an administration nightmare, it's a political economy nightmare, and every single person needs to now lobby for what rate they're at. And then there's all this complexity, completely unnecessary kind of expending of energy and opportunity cost that could have been spent usefully. So, but that, I'm hoping from what you're saying that people will realize that faster, and like, I mean, the path to convergence there is shorter, hopefully.
See, here, let me throw out one more small new insight that I have on this. And you know, again, Avinash is not just a trade theorist, but a fiscal guru as well. And I want to run a new idea by you. So firstly, remember that in India, you will never have one rate. Mm-hmm. I think in India, I recommended 3 rates, you know, a standard and one for demerit goods and one for whatever, right? So I think the debate should be around why can't we have 3, not why didn't we have 1. I think, because to be fair, you can never have one, Karthik, and you know, you know this better than anyone, that, you know, it's a regressive tax. Mm-hmm. And unless you have instruments to kind of whatever, right? If you don't have those instruments to protect those who get hurt by the regressivity, mm-hmm. this will become the instrument to achieve, you know, multiple objectives, mm-hmm. and that's why you get this. So I don't think you'll ever get 1, you get 3. But here's the small insight, and okay, here you are, you have 29 plus 7 plus 1 states, okay? Vastly different, you know, production structures, preferences, objectives, you know, et cetera, you know. In some states, you know, agarbatti is the, you know, thing. In some states, you know, arakanut is the thing. In some state, so you are dealing with this, you know, multiplicity of voices and interests. And so the small insight here is that I think, you know, to convey the sense of incidence, I think is very difficult. I mean, you impose a GST. I mean, there's say an agarbatti producing state. He says, no, I want a lower tax on agarbatti. You say, no, but it's actually a consumption tax, so the incidence is mostly on the consumer. You don't, why you know, say, no, but, you know, it's actually the producer who comes and says, no, we pay the taxes, you know, because in the filing you pay the taxes, so the perceived incidence is very different from the actual incidence. So you get this multiplicity of interests that are being represented, mm-hmm. and that's why you get a plethora of rates and so on. Now, so again, this is, you know, I think that over time, we will see simplification. I think that, for example, once the revenue stabilizes, I think, you know, the 28% rate can be reevaluated. I think even the cesses, I think, have become, you know, there are multiple rates in the cesses. I think there's, I think we can kind of maybe simplify that as well. But I think the broader point I want to make is that, you know, we can't have, you know, first best. Again, to quote Avinash Dixit, the world is second best at best. And you know, so we're going to have, why can't we get to a 3? And I think that's what we should work towards. And you know, harnessing or managing this diversity. I mean, it's just, I mean, if you actually sit through the GST Council meetings over the last 10 years, I mean, a lot of the time has been spent commodity by commodity, you know. Like, I mean, I think we must have made hundreds and hundreds of changes to rates because, you know, of particular interests. And so, you know, it is what it is, yeah.
I mean, but in a way, like, you know, you make the case just in the transaction cost of that process, right? Like, I mean, that if there's a principle rather than bargaining, you know, clearly, hopefully, like, you know, we'll...
True.
And we'll combine this with UBI, because, I mean, of course, this is regressive, but that's kind of one, you know, one instrument, one goal, like, I mean, and, you know, if you say that the goal of GST was harmonization, simplification, one market, and good and simple tax, right? Then you kind of have to... But the kind of irony here is, and we'll get to UBI, is that we now have the instrument, I mean, to offset that with something much more progressive, and so, you know, maybe we'll come back to that. So let me just talk.
No, I think, I mean, I think it's a very fair point that you make, that I think that, you know, if we could have early on said, this is the rule is simplicity, whether we, I don't know whether it would have flown politically, but, you know, maybe it's something that maybe we could have tried harder for that. That's certainly something that is an open hypothetical question.
That's great. So let me move to, I guess, 2 or 3 other big ticket items, right? So we've talked about bankruptcy, which is fine. But it's kind of ironic that we want to be able to unwind loss-making creditor, outstanding debt private companies, but we won't touch PSU privatization. I mean, and there's a bunch of these guys that are bankrupt and wouldn't survive without taxpayer things. So I guess 2 questions. One, why did it take so long? Like, I mean, even for one of these guys, Air India, to show up on the block. And second is, this hasn't happened, and so where do we go from here?
So,
Because again, given that this is a dispensation that is at least bought into this idea of saving taxpayer money, I mean, the numbers are obvious, the case is obvious, the interest groups are relatively small, given that they've shown the political gumption to take on small and medium traders with the GST. Like, I mean, taking on a few 10,000 employees, like, I mean, of an Air India union is relatively small potatoes compared to your entire trader lobby. So, it's not that battle couldn't be won. So what's going on?
Yeah, see, let me try and kind of relate 2 ideas, both stemming from stigmatized capitalism, right? I think that what stigmatized capitalism is doing in India is that you will get more role for the private sector in greenfield and in terms of entry. But greater private sector role in kind of taking over existing public sector assets is going to confront the stigmatized capitalism problem, because the political authorities will always, and public sector bureaucrats will always come under this cloud of, you sold this asset, did you do it in some kind of sweetheart deal? And I think we've spoken about the 4C, the pall of the 4C problem that hangs over. So public sector decision making has been completely paralyzed by this, and something similar. So, see, when you said, I think it's not quite right to say that, nothing has come on, because Air India was on the block for a very long time. But I think that, again, a version of stigmatized capitalism, I think, has kind of taken over. And I think that, could these decisions be second-guessed in the future is something that still creates. Now, the interesting thing about this IBC, which I think I want to, again, do a mea culpa by way of explaining something, is that, see, I was early on in favor of a bad bank, right? But then the IBC happened, and I've come to realize and accept and acknowledge that the IBC was the more realistic way forward because of stigmatized capitalism, and in the following sense, that when a bad bank would have given the lead role to the executive and the political process, and they've been in the front line in terms of these
negotiating haircuts.
Negotiating haircuts. What has happened with, so I think, okay, so I think a consequence of stigmatized capitalism is that more and more decisions will be taken by the judiciary, because they are seen as the most kind of, legitimate and fair kind of people to take this decision. So if you've stigmatized capitalism and you're not sure either about the private sector or about public sector regulating the private sector and all of this, I think you're going to see more and more of this quasi-judicial or really explicitly judicial way of disposing public sector assets. So I think that, therefore, even when it comes to Air India or other things, I think the Niti Aayog, to be fair to them, 2-3 years ago, they've drawn up this list of things, and there hasn't been as much progress, but I think it's because of this. And there's a further complication. Wherever land is involved and land has to be sold in India, I mean, the valuation of that is going to be so contested. Stigmatized capitalism will bite so badly that I think we will have great difficulty in actually dispossessing ourselves of public sector assets going forward. So it'll require a lot of courage, I think, to get rid of this. I think we will have to seek recourse more and more to to judicial kind of ways of. So when we talk about judicial overreach in India, I think we should accept the fact that yes, maybe there's judicial overreach and whatever, but they also have perceived legitimacy because revealed preference. They are the ones whose decisions we seem to be more comfortable with in terms of overcoming stigmatized capitalism.
Yeah, no, and in a way, I mean, my next question was going to be the harder one, which is then, we know the biggest kind of most vexing problem has been private investment, and that's kind of partly linked to the balance sheet problem and the banks. And, so Indradhanush is a massive recapitalization program. And we talked about this 3 years ago, which is, you don't need to privatize all banks. If you just even put one bank and be willing to go below 50% and just because we are in this chicken and egg, right, where you can't sell because valuations are too low, and valuations are low because of the control deep premium, so to speak, right? And I'm going to quote this again just because of how simple and powerful it was. Jeff Sachs said, I think 25 years ago, he said, state-owned hotels irritate me, state-owned steel plants annoy me, and state-owned banks terrify me because it is misallocation of resources across the entire economy, right? So, and what is your verdict on Indradhanush? Why do we know this is not just putting more money, good money after that?
Just factually, Indradhanush.
In the larger bank.
The recapitalization.
Yeah. Indradhanush was the first phase, sorry.
Yeah, recapitalization, yeah. I think that I agree completely that recapitalization going forward will have to be linked to reforms, okay? Now, when we think about reforms, and I'll come to the private sector thing, the one, why not at least one? Yeah. Remember that when we talk about reform of the public sector banks, I think there are two kinds of banks, right? The fundamentally unviable ones, and the others which are kind of on a gradation of, quasi-viability to full viability, right? I think the RBI and the regulator has actually done a very good job on the former category, i.e. there are now, I think, 11 or 12 banks under prompt corrective action, where essentially the idea is over time, they get into narrow banking. I mean, we're not going to in any way get rid of them or whatever, because I think, they still have whatever. But I think the idea is you shrink their balance sheet gradually over time. They do narrow banking. This is also the YB redistribution. I think we are making a lot of progress on that. It's the other ones, the thing. Now, there, I completely agree with you, and I've said this publicly, that we have to have more private sector participation. But I think for three new reasons. The old reason is, politicians interfere with resources. That's still true, but that also happens to private banks in India. So I think we have to be thinking. But I think there are three new reasons why I think we should have more private sector ownership. One, I think this whole 4C problem, the pall hanging over good decision making, I think you get out of the public sector, you have that one. Second, I think that this is kind of the new point, which is that the public sector is just enormously handicapped in terms of their ability to recruit people,
the tenures,
all
the management.
So public sector banks really don't have very good risk assessment capability. I mean, and to be fair to them, it's not because they are bad or inefficient, they just can't recruit. So I don't know whether I mentioned this last time. If I'm repeating myself, forgive me, that in my first year here, Raghu invited me, he was governor, he invited me to come and give the convocation at NIBM. Now, NIBM is an institute, training institute for bankers, run by the RBI. So after the convocation, Raghu and I were chatting, and Raghu said the irony is we pour resources into this. No public sector bank can come and recruit at NIBM, because public sector banks can only recruit through the bank exam process. So this is kind of a ridiculous situation that we're in, that we put in public money and we can't do this. And so those restrictions that happen, I think, are the second reason. The third reason, which again is that we have found in the last 10 years with this, is that public sector lending to public sector to private sector lending is so toxic. Getting out of it is so difficult that we don't want to repeat this going forward. So I think that, therefore, and then there's the other reason that Governor Urjit Patel says is that when you have public sector ownership, it complicates the regulator regulating public sector banks, because there's a kind of ménage à trois, the lines of accountability are not clear, so it becomes more difficult to regulate. So that's probably another reason why. Now, so this is all very well known.
So how do we get
now, but the problem with is here that it's not a matter of, even one more bank means changing the Bank Nationalization Act. That is
But you've also said that's the original sin. Of the Indian economy.
Bank national was original sin. I think, but I think over time, original sins become lasting virtues. I think, and I think that this is one of those things, because the finance minister himself has said, Mr. Jaitley has himself said that, and this is completely bipartisan, by the way. Yeah. If you poll the 500 whatever parliamentarians,
no one wants to let go.
No one wants to let go. Mm-hmm. So how do you get that a change? What is it? No, my own view was that, as Rahm Emanuel said, you can only do this in the aftermath of a crisis, right? Maybe the crisis came a bit too early. Maybe we should have had a crisis early in 2019. But you can't wish a crisis. Obviously, it's a silly thing to say. But I think we will need something quite extreme for something forcing to get out of this. And the last point I would make is that now remember the case that we are making for public sector majority private sector, gets more difficult when ICICI and Axis Bank happens, right? Then they say, he's saying private sector is so panacea, and then they say, no, these things are happening as well. So it makes the political case that much more difficult. I mean, it's easy to say, we need better regulation, etc., but you haven't had that. So how do you convince people that, you're going to have better regulation if you privatize these public sector banks? So it becomes very difficult. Yeah.
Exactly. So let's pivot, to, I think, the social sector broadly, but JAM in particular, right? So I think, this was one of your flagship things. We had this big Delhi Economics Conclave. It was in the surveys. So what's your own assessment of where we've come on the JAM agenda?
So, look, I think that on the JAM agenda, we are obviously making a lot of progress in terms that, the plumbing is getting done, okay? Of course, now you have a little bit of the pushback against the plumbing because of privacy, security, and all those things. So I think since we last met, I think the balance has a little bit changed in terms of how much people are kind of saying, up in arms. So I think, and the Supreme Court is going to decide on this, so let's wait and see. But I think the basic thing that, we need this plumbing to better deliver services, I think the plumbing is getting done. I think we still have, many more use of direct transfers using Aadhaar, and I think there are all these numbers, so many schemes we use, so delivery is getting better. I think we have the world's largest cooking gas program. So I think we have to acknowledge that huge progress is being made. I think that there are two, big challenges that remain ahead. Something that you've written about and you've said, you've made this very insightful point that, and this is something that we said in the last survey as well, that these are still not, even the cooking gas is still not a true DBT, because, at one level it seems as if, consumers face market prices, but really they don't, because they get based on what they consume, right? So the decoupling of prices from support has not yet happened. And I think that's something that needs to sink in more in the broader political ecosphere, that we've started, but getting to true direct benefit transfers where you decouple the income from the price thing, I think we need to make more progress. That's one. Second, I think really very important, I think where the big challenge, where I think this is why we need to work much harder, is that we succeeded on the cooking gas for one very important reason, that the implementation was entirely with the central government. And the OMCs were basically central government, right, run by the ministries, so implementation. But where implementation of the DBT is done by the states, unless the center and the states coordinate, it's going to be very, very difficult. And I think here probably we need to make much more progress. I think
we've discussed this before.
Yeah, we've discussed it before. I think your point, I think, Karthik, is we need more incentive mechanisms like sharing fiscal savings.
Sharing fiscal savings.
In kerosene, by the way, we are doing that. We are making some progress, not DBT kerosene, but actually in the kerosene subsidy actually being rationalized over time. We are making. But I think that, this is, so I think there are two challenges, right, in this center state thing. Three. One is the financial savings, okay? The other is, central and state machineries have to work together. I would say, give a lot of credit. In the case of, fertilizer, there's, this plumbing is being built up between the center and the states, and I think that's happening. But I think there's a kind of third point, which is that when you do these reforms, remember the political incentives, there's a kind of craving for attribution, right? How do you, do something in collaboration, how does a state government collaborate with the center and yet say, give me credit for the reform? I think that complicated political incentive attribution, that, who gets credit for what is done, both for the center and for the states, is something that certainly I hadn't thought about, but having watched this over the last 3-4 years, I think that is, I think that's a kind of deep political, political issue that I think we need to think about much more carefully.
So, but I think, exactly, I mean, tying those second and third points, I mean, I've spent a fair bit of time with states on this, and I think right now, from the state's perspective, even if there's leakage, for the most part, it's leakage happening in the state, right? So there are political economy benefits of that process, but tightening up just means the fiscal savings go to the center. So it really should not be that difficult, right? I mean, to have this fiscal compact that says, if you do this, here is kind of not just the fiscal savings, but you know what, maybe we in the center take credit for cleaning up the existing program, and you can take credit for the new allocations you do with the saved money we give you.
But my friend, in politics, that just will not fly in politics. This thing, you go to the populace and say, mujhe iske liye do, unke liye wo do. I mean, this is.
But anyway, but the broader point.
What is the word? It's a pooling equilibrium. It's not a separating equilibrium, and you need separating equilibria for
political credit.
For political
Let's switch to, I think, the one place where there has been something promising. So I think agriculture is probably the most vexing chakravyuha of them all, right? In the sense that, we had.
I think we have to come to health, education as well.
Well, yeah, no, but education. But education, we're not even. I mean, you haven't said much on education, so
but let's come to that after agriculture.
No, exactly. So I mean,
otherwise, Rukmini will not buy me her the gin and tonic she's promised me.
But I think that's provided. So I was planning to refrain from education partly because he hasn't written on it, but I can always get to that. But on agriculture in particular, because this is more directly related to the JAM agenda, right? I mean, we know that back in the 60s, you had these 4 or 5 major policies put in place to a nation feeling food insecure and saying we'll do what it takes to have food security, MSP, fertilizer subsidy, APMC strengthening, PDS, and then states doing electricity and water. And together, this is about 2.5% of GDP. It's among the most distortionary, regressive. It's this insane mess. Now, and
you said it, not me.
Yeah, I teach a class in the Indian economy now, and that's what it is. It is, I think, the classic example of a chakravyuha. You go in, there's just no coming out because these things are tangled. So I think you've written an op-ed today. I think we're all optimistic, partly about the Telangana experiments, but I mean, and I love what they're doing, but to be honest, I mean, in a way, this is the easy part, right? They haven't really bitten any tough bullet, they've just given out more money, okay? So I guess 2 questions. I mean, one is what would the contours of a center-state fiscal reform-oriented compact look like? I mean, that is able to go to chief ministers and saying, if in lieu of exactly the kind of thing you wrote in the op-ed today, this much fertilizer subsidy, this much whatever procurement benefit, this is the incidence, and we'll just kind of, if you cancel this, we'll give this all to you. So I think there's 2 questions. One is structuring the deal. Second is, how do you make this actually politically incentive compatible for the CM? Because it's too risky for a CM to take that on at the level of a whole state. So, does it make sense to think about then pilots at a district level? But then the problem with that is you can't get rid of this subsidy because you can always divert from other places. So I think experimenting in a world when you have dual prices is also really hard. So how would this kind of way forward?
So on the second one, Karthik, we've spoken about this. I think that it's not just the experimental thing. I think that, if politicians want credit, I mean, they're not going to get any credit for doing a pilot. They're going to get credit for only doing something big. So I think that's why the pilot idea, learning from it,
But
etc.
if I may come in, I think, I think what I have in mind is more of a 5-year agenda that in 2019 we go to a bunch of chief ministers, and say, here's 5 years, here is this big new idea. You want to do this, you'll get credit. But he says, I don't want to blow up my whole system with this huge change. I want to scale up in 5 years, but I want to pilot for 1 year so that I learn operational lessons and then go scale. But even that is hard to do because of the way this is all or nothing, right?
I don't know. I don't know how many politicians, would, maybe that's the ideal way to work. But I think when you announce, because I was with the Telangana CM for many hours, and I had we discussed all this. The interesting thing is that he is aware of all the deficiencies in the scheme, in terms of
regressivity,
it doesn't
landless.
replace landless. It doesn't replace existing the fiscal thing, and also aware of the fact that politically giving it also to the big landowners is a problem. So he's aware also of the fact that he has to scale back other things, and also that maybe I can't say we won't give it to the large landowners, but I'll use some behavioral give it up type things. So he's thought about it very, very carefully and deeply, and but the point is that the good policy is not, he doesn't perceive it as good politics. So
right,
so
exactly.
how
do we make that happen?
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I think probably the most realistic way forward, I think, on this is it has to be done cooperatively between the center and the states. I think I'm more and more convinced of that. So I think cooperative federalism being harnessed like the GST, and Minister Jaitley has said this actually, that cooperative federalism should now be used also in agriculture, and is something that. So I think that structuring the deal. I think firstly, there's the other point to make is that I think that when state governments realize, and the center realizes, because I think this is the new thought that I want to interject in this conversation, that this whole DBT, whatever, Raitu Bandhu, whatever, conceptually what I want states and center to imbibe is the fact that we have a whole panoply of schemes for bad states of the world. Crop insurance, loan waivers. And there's resources and capacity devoted to that. We have a whole set of schemes for good states of the world. Monsoons good, prices come down, then we have MSP and price deficiency schemes. And we have schemes, regardless of the states of the world, with all these subsidies, all right? I think that if you just thought about it and said, look, you can economize on state capacity and resources by combining all these things into this, where actually the magnitude of the benefit you can deliver would actually be much greater than when you did all this. I think there maybe we have to, there's a role for all of us to actually now start making this in this particular way that I know. And I don't think people have internalized this, that how we, bad states, good states, all states, and how we can replace that. I think that's one case to be made. I think that over time, part of this, to me, the more realistic way going forward for this is for the center, I think, more and more to say, look, and this is the discussions that Jammu and Kashmir was having on implementing UBI, that states say this is in our interest, right? And I think more and more states are realizing that. So I think the politics is coming around, but they say we don't have the resources. And in the case of Jammu and Kashmir, what the discussions were to tell the center, look, I'm not asking you to give me more, just untie your aid, right? Are you giving me Manrega of fertilizer subsidy? Untie that and let me do that with what I want. And in Jammu and Kashmir, similarly, I think we could get a conversation here. And the pilot, I would say, is not pilot sort of one part of a state, but a pilot compact between a state and the center on one. And I think that can happen. I think that, of course, they have all the politics comes in, which states you want to do it with, and so on. I leave that to better minds thing. But I think there is, for example, another chief minister I will not name, he said to me explicitly very recently that, Arvindji, we do all these things, PDS, MSP, crop loan. And he said, we are not able to deliver. I'll be very honest with you. And he said, therefore, this is the attraction of DBT. And so I think that there are states which are coming around, and especially if you can show that the magnitudes can be quite big. I think a fiscal compact like the center and 1 or 2 pilot states, I think is doable.
So let me, I think so this is fantastic and I think it's viable. Now let's just switch the last part of JAM, which is the delivery of specific social benefits, right? So PDS, THR, ICDS, these are the conversations happening. So, we saw with the EPOS, and I think, if I may summarize very quickly between what we found in Andhra and now what we're finding in Jharkhand. See, I think the big reason why, the funny thing is both Andhra and Jharkhand, we find a reduction in leakage. But I think politically the big difference was that in Andhra, the decision was made to keep the fiscal outlays the same and pass on all benefits to the beneficiary. So beneficiaries were clearly better off and 90% were in favor. Whereas the Jharkhand and the PDS rollout of biometric POS has reduced leakage but has not in any way improved the beneficiary experience. So the on-the-ground report that we get from Jean Rez and team is actually correct in the sense that there is no reduction overall in what people are getting, but there is a clear increase in inconvenience and number of unsuccessful trips. And so the question is, why was that political? Because the savings is the same, but why put it all to fiscal savings as opposed to having some of that also improve the beneficiary experience? And there are very concrete ways of doing this, right? So there were ways of empowering the beneficiaries through DBT and choice. There were ways of empowering. So I think the larger point here is, if we want the DBT agenda to succeed in a democracy, I think putting the beneficiary experience at the center of that is just critical, and I just haven't seen enough of that, and I don't know, what your
I think, see, in this particular case, remember those key choices on implementation are made by the states. So why, Jharkhand chose that route, whereas Andhra chose the other one?
Well, no, but Andhra Smart Cards was a prior program. So this was more responding to the central diktat to kind of do EPOS, the POS machines. So it was pretty much standardized. I mean, I don't think the states had much leeway in this. So anyway, it's just an observation. I'm not asking you to defend.
I think that, but I think the point you're making is a very good one. I think certainly, see, I'm 100% with you in that making the consumer experience, I think politicians realize that the political economy works if you actually do that. And, I think we should and we will, I think, take that experience to heart. See, on the choice is where I feel I'm not sure how the politics on that will pan out. I'm not sure.
So, but the good news is we now have a pilot in Maharashtra that's been kind of signed off on an MOU. So hopefully, and Gujarat is now interested. So
Muralidharan et al. 2022 will be the insight. I know. Look, if it works, I think it will be very good. I just worry a little bit about scaling up this choice. What if 50% want one and 50% want the other? How you implement that, and what the kind of externalities are. I haven't thought through, but I think I know that. Remember, in Jaipur, it was a bit of a complication when you did it in Rajasthan.
But that was mainly because the implementation architecture wasn't ready. So we needed the EPOS to roll out. But let me
you've become a better plumber, I take it. Okay.
So let me just conclude with 1 or 2 final thoughts on this. See, I think, and this partly relates to the UBI. So I know, Pranab's talked about 10%, Vijay's talked about 3.5%, Economic Survey has something in that range. And you also know that I have, in private, pushed for something slightly different, which is basically kind of a 1%, what I call an equitable growth dividend or an inclusive growth dividend. And that has, I think, 3 or 4 advantages. Now, it has one big political cost, that the number is not going to be big enough to excite people. But on the other hand, I think the problem, so the 3 or 4 things it does for me, right, is based on what I've seen on the ground. And we've now done about 40,000 household surveys on this. I'm just not confident that any existing benefit should be replaced with DBT, because the politics of that will always, because you haven't shown that you can implement in the last mile, right? So in these 3 pilots that were done in the 3 union territories, the government data says 99% of people got the benefits. Our household data says almost 30% say they have no idea that they got the benefit. So there's just that gap. And so the logic of a 1% is more as a proof of concept to get the plumbing, to show that you can move the money, to get the universal financial inclusion, get something progressive because it's 100 rupees a month for everybody, put the children's quota in the mothers. And then eventually what you're showing is, once you've shown that, you can then run the referendum in the horse race sector by sector to say, hey, what would you like? So is that something, because we've got this whole Jan Dhan kind of push, but the government still has no visibility on the last mile access to cash, right? So our data in Jharkhand now shows you're trying to do this maternal benefit transfers, and the average woman is about 45 minutes away from the nearest cash point. And you're expecting people 6, 7, 8 months pregnant. So we are now cautioning very strongly against any substitution-based thing, even though this was my prior that this would be good, as opposed to starting with just supplementation. And if you want to supplement, the amount has to be small. And is that something that we could consider?
Yeah, I think it's I think a very good idea. It's worth trying, because I do think that the replacement will be, you cannot replace unless you can show, the thing works, and therefore, I think solving the last mile problem is going to be critical before any of this, before either version can take off. Actually, even to implement, UBI a la Bardhan or Joshi, you will need the thing. But I think that my own view is that I think in some states like Andhra and Telangana, probably they're getting close to getting that stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let me just say one final.
So I think there, we could try the bolder versions of this experiment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and the final concern, and I think this is just channeling just the, and again, being more realistic about the political economy, right? I think most of us who think about cash versus kind, you just see the efficiency properties. But there is something, there's an elephant in the room, which is indexation, right? So the fact that the social security pension has been fixed at 200 rupees for close to 10 years and not even adjusted for inflation is kind of a scandal, right? I mean, I think a lot of economists wrote about this, like in the context of the budget. And even that modest adjustment was not made. So then the question is, if you are a rights-based activist who might trust you and me to kind of be well-meaning, but doesn't trust that the benefit can be maintained, because the moment you take it into cash, then kind of, essentially the purchasing power of that can just be eroded if that's not indexed at the very beginning. So, do you have thoughts on how one would kind of just mitigate against that? And just, practically speaking, the pension hasn't moved in 10 years.
Yeah. See, I think that, again, this old age pension thing is something, I remember when we had these meetings leading up to the budget, this was something that was very strongly advocated in those meetings. And I think, the government did discuss that very seriously. It's something that the government is aware of. But again, here, remember, the complication here is that both the states and the center both give pensions, old age pensions. So you get into the same thing of, if the center gives, will the states reduce, and will this, there's this kind of a little bit of a game theoretic thing between the center and the states going on. But the point about the indexation, I've in fact I've not, to be honest with you, thought about that thing clearly enough. Are there any schemes in government which we really index? I don't know.
I think most.
I mean, I know that civil servant salaries are indexed, but apart from that, I don't know.
But when it comes to the most vulnerable,
yeah. I think that maybe we should. Huh? Are indexed. Oh yeah. So Manrega, that's good. So that's a very good idea.
And that was in the law. So
So I think maybe this is just. Case specific, and I think I do think that if and when we see some changes in this old age pension, I think there will be some attempt to index as well.
So I just realized, I mean, time is flying, and so so in the interest of having Q&A, I just want to spend at least 5 to 7 minutes pivoting to one really important topic, which I think dear to both of our hearts, which I think just goes back to this issue of capacity. So we've talked about state capacity of various sorts, implementation. We've talked about that, but I think I want to focus explicitly on capacity for economic analysis within the government, right? And so the specific point I have in mind is that if you think about a lot of what you see happening in this government, my broad from the outside impression is that there's a strong focus on implementing better, but not necessarily a strategic look at a budget to say like what should be done and should not be done, what should be wound down. So when I then look at each line ministry and saying like, who is the person who should do this, in principle you have an economic advisor, who should be the person doing this broader strategic analysis of saying where is the budget going, what should we be doing, less more. But in practice, these economic advisors have just become joint secretaries, who are kind of handling pretty much line functions as opposed to that kind of economic analysis function. So I guess that's my sense from multiple ministries, right? So I guess one question for you is two things, right? One is in terms of amplifying the ability to deliver economic policy inputs into every department, including education. So I mean, I'm not, if you think about how much we spend or the impacts of RTE, which has really just been a monstrosity in terms of what the Inspector Raj it's unleashed and kind of inhibited supply. It has been a monstrosity, but there isn't necessarily, I haven't even pushed you on it because I know there isn't bandwidth in the CEA's office, to go look at that. But sector after sector, would benefit from that. And similarly, each state, and we talked about this last time, would benefit from the equivalent of a CEA office. I mean, these are country-level economies that post-14 Finance Commission have fiscal and policy space, but if we don't get in with those inputs right now, you're going to be kind of stuck in potentially, and it's been both depressing because we hoped that 14th Finance Commission will give you competitive federalism of adopting good ideas, but it seems the race to the bottom is just as likely with, say, farm loan waivers, right? Going around.
Competitive populism.
Competitive populism. And so it feels like a really important time to kind of build that capacity, at the state level.
Yeah.
And how should we go about thinking of this problem?
So I do think one of my failures, as chief economic advisor, was the fact that there was huge demand from state finance ministers and chief ministers, at least 5, 6, 7 of them. I would like to think in response to our success at the center, or even otherwise, wanting to create these offices, and just did not have the bandwidth. See, I do think, and we've discussed this, that the profile of a CEA office in the states and the center will have to be slightly different. I think at the center, it's not an either or, but the balance has to be more towards policy, whereas in the center, in the states, it'll have to be more towards implementation and design and things. So in a sense, if you think about, I think, remember Esther Duflo says economists are plumbers. Robert Solow says economists are intellectual sanitation workers flushing out bad ideas. I think sanitation workers at the center and plumbers at the states is kind of one way of,
But you'll need that at the state too, as
exactly.
more fiscal and policy space.
Yeah, I'm saying, just a balance, I'm saying, we need both. So I think that, yes, we need more, okay? But let me say, one is that we have spent a lot of effort in trying to build capacity in the Indian Economic Service, right? I think this is a service that has a lot of potential. I think that, we're investing in training, improving conditions of service. We're thinking also about a new training, center for the IES. I think so. I think the Indian Economic Service, in some ways, has to be the vehicle for this larger role for economic policy making. I think that's, and I think there is, agreement broadly, I think, agreement in government on that. Now, however, the question is really kind of the other point that you said, how they become joint secretaries. Factually, that's not actually true. I think it varies. In some ministries, they do perform, policy analysis. In other ministries, maybe they tend to become like regular bureaucrats. But I think, in fact, we've had lots of discussions within government on how do we make, economic service officers in different ministries kind of, have this both kind of a matrix structure, exactly. Have both reporting to the secretary line and also have more, horizontal, talking with other economic service officers, links with the CEA. See, I think, Karthik, coming back to this, these are things that, again, you cannot formalize. I think you have to have much more this happening through informal networks and so on. So I think it's going to depend a lot on, the service itself and the CEA as well, and the relationships that they all have with secretary. Just to give you one example, early on when I came, we had, there was this fertilizer secretary, Jugal Mahapatra, a fantastic, a really wonderful officer, and we collaborated a lot with him and with his economic service team and kind of tried to build those synergies. So in that case, it worked. But in other cases, it didn't work. Also, we had a huge clothing package that the government implemented. Again, joint work between the Indian Economic Service, the Office of CEA, and the line ministry as well. And that was also, I think, very helpful. But again, these things have to happen opportunistically on a case-by-case basis. Formalizing this, I just feel very reticent because I just don't have any faith that formal structures will deliver if you don't have the right people.
Okay. I mean, I guess my concern is just that then the sectors that get reacted on are the ones where there's personal engagement as opposed to institutional. So, and maybe
I'm going to have to
wrap up.
use
And
executive.
So no,
You
there's
monopolized,
there's no clock,
Arvind, and we have a lot of people who are
That's
wanting
right.
to ask questions.
Yeah, I'm
So
wrapping
you
up.
will have to really move on to the Q&A.
Perfect. So, no, but it's
But
no clock. But the ratio was maintained.
Ratio.
So thanks to Arvind for delightful and insightful set of comments. So let's throw it open to the floor. I'm sure we start at 6:15. We can go a little past 8. So let's just hands up and collect questions.
Yeah, there's a question here. Yeah, please.
My name is Arvind Padi. I'm the country director for ICRISAT, but I have worked in the government in earlier positions. Sir, you may recollect our interactions in fertilizer ministry. My question is on the agriculture subsidies, but you have already given a new idea of the QB, as you call now, quasi-UBI. But my question is, and I would very humbly submit, why don't we go for the structural reforms in the agriculture sector? Because in agriculture sector, with my experience, I know good economics is bad politics, always. So why don't we go for the structural reforms like land leasing or APMC or the marketing and other stuff? That's my limited.
Land, what is the first one?
Sir, land leasing, APMC, marketing reforms and other stuff. The structural reforms in the agriculture sector.
I think we should take them individually. Yeah, that's what we did last time. So why don't you? Because the questions will be too dispersed otherwise.
I will just throw it back at you and say, when you say, why don't we? Why hasn't there been, people who've done this over the last 35 years? What has prevented governments, state governments from doing this? And I don't buy the view that necessarily that good economics is bad politics. I mean, this is my same question on education as well. I mean, and Rinky's here. I mean, for me, the big puzzle about India has been, why is it that, there's not been political opportunity in saying, I will educate millions and millions of children, or I will provide millions and millions of farmers with, better and improved livelihoods. It's not obvious to me that there's not political opportunity, but clearly it hasn't happened. And I still don't fully understand, but I think those are some of the biggest. So to say do structural reform, we've been saying this for 35 years and nothing has happened. And, so I don't know what the meaning of saying it again is. I would like to understand more why it doesn't become political opportunity either in education or in agriculture. That's to me the bigger question. Avinash has a question, yeah.
You pointed out very nicely how hard it is to sell to politicians the very simplest ideas that we know as economists. And sometimes economists, either explicitly or implicitly, have developed kind of clever ways of selling them, even though we know that that's not true. So we know really that the benefit of international trade is to get imports more cheaply than it would cost us to make them ourselves, just the general principle of comparative advantage. But instead, a lot of trade liberalization in many countries was sold successfully by saying that exports are good and taking in more imports is the kind of price we have to pay to get the benefit of exports. Did you find this happening in your work, that you had to develop not correct but sellable ways of making points, and do you have any good examples you can give us?
Yeah, I can talk about my failures rather than successes in this regard. For example, I think Aba-learner symmetry is something that I just could not communicate at all. I'm just trying to think whether there are examples where I see. I don't know whether this is a good example or not. But the whole notion of, how to, say maybe price increases in some sectors are not warranted. Even though you think they may benefit the farmer, I think that you can say, for example, it violates your international obligations. That's the reason why you should not do it. Because if you notice, it just reminds me, these tariff increases that we did, that not one of them violated our WTO obligations. So I think this is one thing that I think you can invoke and say, look, you can't do this because you are, So that's one example. But over the course of the evening, if I can think of one way I would say we try, kind of cheat, is that, I've often found it good to move between expressing something as a share of GDP and expressing something as, just in nominal terms. That's some cheating I like to do often, if you think that you want to, exaggerate the benefits, then you use nominal terms. But if you want to say, oh my God, it's very bad, then you say do the share of GDP. So those are some tricks that you can do. But I think mostly it's been some of these things are, like, I don't know, incidence. How do you convey incidence of taxes? It's really very hard to. But I actually one success I will say that. So I think that when the GST discussions came up, gold was a very difficult thing, and essentially about 2 years ago, even before the GST, the states levied a 1% tax, and the center didn't levy any tax on gold. So the big debate was, how do you convey that this is actually not a bad thing, because there's massive opposition from the gold traders to this. So I remember what we did was that we used the NSS to show, which people didn't realize, that how much, because people were selling it as, the gold traders sell it as, oh, this is the man on the street, the poor man. For him, gold is a thing of great whatever symbolism, and it's your security and so on. We use the NSS numbers to show that actually something like 85 to 90% of gold is consumed by the top 10%. And the finance minister actually used this in Parliament and said, look, you think that we are hurting the poor, but actually this is something that, I don't know whether it exactly answers your question, but these are some of the kind of tricks that, or kind of evidence that you have to bring to bear to try and make good economics, good politics. It's the right one? Find the right evidence, yeah. Yeah, find the right evidence. I thought you were going to say, Avinash, that one of the things that and Mike Musa has a brilliant paper on this, that remember that tariffs don't affect employment, right? But this using the cost of jobs saved is a trick that, even though it's strictly speaking not kosher, is something that you try and do too. So I think there are, in fact, I would say that one of the, this is actually a lot of the heart of, the art of persuasion, through means fair, sometimes foul. I think it's finding that is kind of the art of the job. Art of this, exactly, yeah.
So my question is with respect to education. So we've not discussed education a lot in this discussion. So if you could throw light on what has been the government's thinking on education per se, and what are the reforms which you think should happen? Because traditionally, as you said, that politicians do not look at education from the point of view of votes, but there's a different experiment going with respect to Delhi government.
Correct.
So I want to know, say going down 5 years down the line, what has to be those changes which have to be done, whether it has to be completely public in nature, public-private? What are your views on education on a larger context?
See, I think that, going forward, if the Delhi experiment succeeds, I think, we will find more and more. So this is, when you talk about competitive federalism, this is one, idea spreading through success in some states. I think that's why I think the Delhi experiment is a very powerful one. I think that you have to. I think that this is a subject which, at least primary education, is something that state governments basically controlled, right? So I think that this is something that more and more state governments have to see opportunity, and the central government can play a broadly supportive role, but it can't be in the forefront of driving this change. So I think it's going to, but let me throw out a very controversial idea here, and this is complete armchair, psychologizing that, or theorizing that I want to do. That, one is this whole question of why we don't see more political opportunity in whatever. There are some, but the thought, and this is not my own thought, someone actually pointed, when I was teaching, one of the things we did after the survey was I did a massive open online course, a MOOC, and when we're doing that, talking about this education, a kind of left of center economist in Mumbai, a lecturer at Mumbai University, stood up and said, look, I think the reason we have not made progress on education is that we Indians, caste, vertical stratification, etc., do not fundamentally subscribe to the ethic of equality. If around the world, if you see where primary education spread, the role of the church, the role of Marxist parties, and even in India, that there is something about our society which is so vertically stratified that we haven't bought. And I think saying that all humans are equal, therefore all humans should have basic health and education, is something that I think we need to think about more carefully as a society. And I think that this is one of those thoughts, does culture determine outcomes, is one of those really hairy things I'm putting forward. But if you look at the history of, if you read that great lovely book by Myron Weiner on the role of the child and state and child in India, and the contrast with Sweden, with Germany, with how universal education spread. Now, I say this, and maybe because I do think something about our vertical stratification comes in the way of this, thing. But having said that, I think we shouldn't use this as a counsel for fatalism and despair. I think these things can change. I think that the work of Pratham and Asar, for example, shows that there are kind of simple ways where we can actually improve learning outcomes. Your own technology study, Karthik, the stuff that Pratham has done in terms of remedial education and things. But why it doesn't catch on is to me still a kind of puzzle and a mystery. There are such, these are, if you say these are like 100,000 rupee bills, or post demonetization, I have to be careful which bills are under the lamp. Maybe the 500 rupee note, not the whatever under the lamp. I think that if there are these bills that are lying around, remedial learning, technology, why hasn't it happened? Why has it taken us, so long? One state government after 70 years is actually making this a political issue. Judge me on what I do on education. Very seldom has that happened. And I just don't understand why this hasn't happened.
Labor laws, why can we change them? Have we missed the bus on labor-intensive industrialization? Do we have a window of perhaps only 10 years before automation becomes a more serious problem? This whole range of issues.
Vijay, very good and a very difficult question. See, I'll be completely honest with you that there have all been these raging debates going on employment went up, employment went down, EPFO data, ESIC data, etc., etc. My honest answer is that I honestly don't know what is happening to employment in India over the last many years, after the last survey came out, because I just don't think that we have had good, reliable, consistent data on this. So I don't know what is going on. I do know, I think we can say that probably we need to create many more opportunities than we are creating, because the nature of the problem is just very big. I think that the whole automation, etc., etc., I think that cannot become again a kind of thing for fatalism, because I think, it's 10, 15 years down the road, and opportunity is being created. China moving up the value-added chain, becoming uncompetitive, that, why shouldn't come to India? Why should it go to Vietnam, Laos, Bangladesh? I think, so we do have opportunity in that. But the one thing I will say, which is, an experience of the last, as a result of this, which is also something that I apply to stigmatized capitalism, is that I am now convinced that if we want to get big employment, i.e., the 10,000 job fact, 15,000, I think it's not going to be about labor laws one way or the other. And it's not the old argument about, labor laws work, don't work. My own view is that the only way we can make progress on this is the following, that we get these companies coming in, challenges to that from labor unions, et cetera, and then governments coming and saying, we stand by you. Because we have such a record to undo in terms of this, that we are not going to be credible as employment-creating destinations just by changing laws. We have to show that, we will support investors when they come in and when troubles arise. I mean, that's when the, whatever hits the wheel hits the road or the rubber hits the road. Because there have been examples, actually, I know of one example where I know some factories in India, they were open, slightly large size, in investor-friendly states. At the first sign of trouble, the government washed its hands off, and the investor said, I cannot survive. So it is about, when we talk about creating this investor or employment-friendly environment, it is about, governments expending capital to actually defend this. It's not about just, changing a law. And unless that happens, I don't think we will see really big employment. Because investors, frankly, are very nervous about creating, I know textile exporters, for example, who say, we'll create 4, 5, maximum 1,000 factories. We will not create 10, 15 because it's just too risky. Something happens, we may be left in the lurch, and then all our investments are. So that's my. Shyam had a question. No. Okay, question there at the back.
Let me introduce myself, Ambassador of Armenia. Thank you for this informative and thought-provoking discussion. You have touched upon the agriculture sector of the country, which is, for very obvious reason, is very important. 50% of GDP, half of labor force, unless I'm mistaken, 2/3 of poor population, live in rural areas, and the gentleman also raised the issue about structural reforms. I'm not going to, challenge you in this regard, but a few days ago I read that according to the OECD report, for the last 2 decades, the agricultural sector of India has not generated enough revenues to make profitable the sector for farmers. So 2 decades, it is not 1 year, 2 years, it's not the BJP or Congress government. So I was very surprised as an outsider, so I would appreciate if you comment. What is your view on the situation? Is it a curable, or it is a chronic disease? So this is the first question. And second question, sort of a little bit conceptual. You have talked about the capitalism. I mean, each country strikes its own balance between state and market. I would like to know where does India stand now? Thank you.
See, sorry, on the first one, there's a question I've been curious about. So is there any study out there that just shows the distribution of farm economics to say what fraction of farming in India is unviable without kind of the subsidy regime? Like, I'm just curious. I haven't seen a study like that. Is there something? And then, of course, you should take the question.
Yeah. We have, periodic cost of cultivation surveys that gives you net farm income in the different states. You get it by commodity, you get it by state, you get it by land holding. Kapil, correct me if I'm wrong. So we do have estimates on that, and what you find is that these incomes are very low. median income.
But this is after subsidized inputs. Once
this is after the subsidies are included in the income. Correct, Kapil? Yeah, they are included. So even after that, they're quite low. Yeah, they're quite low. Now, so it is something that is kind of, but the one exception to this, I think, is in the period of the global commodity boom, I think Indian agriculture did, remarkably well. It was actually, I was struck by this, agricultural growth, wage growth, farm income growth did very well for about a 6, 7, 8 year period when agriculture, more so than even the immediate aftermath of the Green Revolution, actually. So the irony is that it was when it was a kind of a demand boom for Indian agricultural exports did phenomenally well in that period as well. So there has been a period where we did well, but it didn't last long enough, and it was kind of externally driven. Essentially, relative prices improved enormously, and therefore incomes improved enormously. On the second point about the state versus markets, I think that this is maybe completely trivial what I'm going to say, but it is a completely false debate of state versus markets. Completely false. I think that the original Karl Polanyi insight is just staggeringly valid, that markets are embedded in states, and it's states that have to both create markets, regulate markets, fill in for markets. So, and in India, it's particularly acute that, even stigmatized capitalism that we see now is ultimately that the lack of trust that the state can regulate the private sector or is not hand in glove with the private sector. So I think it's a completely, false dichotomy. I think, if you get good states in India, state capacity, you will also get, markets. And I'm completely convinced about that. I notice Avinash is, approving, nodding approvingly, so I take it that...
yeah, I think it's a good time to, cite an insight from Dr. Y.V. Reddy's book. He said in India, it's not about state versus market. It's state and the market conspire to keep the, conspire to hurt the poor. So it's not, there's a tight interface.
Yeah.
Shekhar?
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, you've done dramatic things with the economic survey, and a lot of that has depended on really imaginative use of data. How are we going to sustain that kind of access to data that you made possible for the economic survey, for the larger research community? Because that really is a key issue, the tremendous amount of big data in a whole range of areas that really would inform us so much better. That was one, and the second part of the question was, what you have done for the CEA's office, how are we going to institutionalize some of those features?
So I think, let me take the first question first, and then the second question is a bit more difficult because I have to overcome my vanity to answer that. So it'll take some time to do that. But I think on the first point, I think that 100% we need more and more data becoming available. By the way, I think that one small thing that we should give the government, and especially my colleague Hasmukh Adya in the Revenue Department, credit for, that Thomas Piketty, challenged me in Jaipur and said, these numbers that I used to produce, I can't do it for India because you don't produce that. And I said, I'll make it available for you. And then I came back and, the Revenue Department actually made it public in a way that now he's got the ammunition to say India is, they're doing very badly on inequality or whatever. So it's kind of a little bit backfired on us, but, but at least we made transparent the data. So I think that, now, how to make it more accessible, I think is a much more difficult question. I think in the first instance, and here I will be a little bit immodest, I think in the first instance, I think we need government itself to use this data more. I think we have so much, just to give you one example, I am super excited by the fact that our GST data can potentially allow us for the first time to produce demand-side estimates of GDP, both for the center and for the states. We have that kind of data. But how do we, build that capacity in this I think, we have, I think, MOSPI and, the World Bank is also helping them. MOSPI is making strides. But making this available more publicly, I just don't know how, we can do that. I think we need to have protocols. And I think this whole de-anonymizing data, building protocols for that, I think we need to kind of start with the tradition of that more, and then only then I think will both the the government be comfortable about the data and people also being able to use it better. So I think we need to, I think we've just started that, I think. On your question about how do we institutionalize this, I have an op-ed coming out, which I haven't shown my wife. I think if I show it to her, she will ban me from publishing it. See, I think just maybe ending on a personal note here, I think that the office of CEA in India is actually very, very unique. In the following sense, I mean this in the following sense, that do the thought experiment. In the United States, if the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors were also chief economist of the Treasury and sat in the Treasury, that is what the CEA's role is, because he's both close enough to decision-making to be a high-frequency policy advisor, of course, along with the team that he has, not individually, along the team, but he has enough distance as well to play the more, strategic advisory role as well. So it is an absolutely unique institution in India. So I think that the institutionalizing on this can happen in two ways, right? I think one, I think governments will have to buy into this idea that this is a unique public institution like the RBI or Election Commission or TRI, which I'm convinced that it is. It is a unique public institution because it has so much scope and so much thing. I think governments, I mean, my government, this government, and certainly the finance minister bought into that conception of the CEA. So, but I think it needs to be more broadly shared, across governments, across the public. So that's one thing. And then you have to choose, as appointments are critical. I think you have to choose CEAs who also would have the, would share this and this, share this idea. Many years ago, Vijay Kelkar once said that, jobs like this, I think that the attribute that is the most important, I think, because I'm sure I'm not half as smart as many people here, half as good a team builder as many people here, but I think you need a kind of manic energy for this job. I think so. I think choosing someone with kind of manic energy, the kind of energy that Rukmini brings to Pratham, so many people Devesh has brought to building CASI, you are doing now with the University of California, San Diego. I think that that manic energy and passion that these things important that I think that so governments have to buy into it, and you have to choose. Appointments are critical, as you know. I mean, otherwise, nothing works.
Should we go a little over because we started at 6:10? Yeah. So I'll take a question here.
There's one question at the back. One question at the back.
Okay, let's take the one in the back first.
Let's take the question at the back.
Oh, sorry.
What about it? Yeah, absolutely.
Let's take this first.
So obviously we saw.
Please introduce yourself.
I'm Rajiv Mantri. I'm a writer and investor. We saw a range of indirect tax reforms, obviously, over the last couple of years, especially with the GST. So on the direct tax side, with the committee that has been constituted last year, I think you were also a part of it. Is there anything that you can tell us what direction it is going in? Any? I know.
No. Even if I knew, I wouldn't tell you. But I do think that the committee, Arvind Modi is heading that committee, and I know he is fantastic. He has some great ideas. The committee has had some excellent discussions. So I think you will see, at least in terms of the recommendations of the committee, the principles of simplicity, easier procedures, and remember that on just one thought on this is that, just a digression, because I think there are lots of very, very thoughtful people here on this. And let me tell you what I see as the challenge of direct taxation in India. That on the one hand, you find that corporate taxes around the world are declining, and the US tax cut is the latest example of that. A country like India, where the costs of doing business are, say, at a premium relative to other countries, I mean, at the very least, we have to be competitive on the simplicity and the level of taxes. So I think that's something that we will see, at least in terms of recommendations, low rates, broad base, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that it's just now being forced upon us by international events. The challenge, I think the trick, the challenge is the following, right? That our body politic, demands and requires a certain progressivity that, the guys who earn a lot have to pay their fair share of taxes. So on the one hand, you have to combine this simplicity, low taxes, which is going to involve loss of revenue, with a need for progressivity and kind of taxing, not just to make up the revenue, but this demand to for this. Now, and you can't do it in the old ways of having very high marginal tax rates. You can't do that because I mean, the truth is that not just is capital mobile, that talented individuals are mobile. High net worth guys are mobile as well, and so the tax base is getting slippery. So how do you combine that with that need for progressivity? And so I just think that we have to find new handles for that.
Property.
And I think, I was, Karthik, you said it on my behalf, I didn't say it, but I think people are realizing around the world.
It has to be.
Now, let me tell you one last kind of small insight here on this property, right? Because remember, both the third tier and the second tier tax property, okay, or are allowed to tax property. My small political economy observation in India is that if you look at the record of the second and third tier, their collection of tax revenue has been abysmal, and there will be lots of people here who will say, including my friend Sudipto here, who will say, oh, we haven't devolved enough to the second and third tier. I will challenge that fiercely, because even relative to what they're allowed to do, they collect 10, 15, 20%. So the thought I want to inject is that is it the case that, Dilip Mukherjee wrote very nice papers that decentralization has some downsides in terms of, corruption and all of capture and things. But I think decentralization may have this other thing that if you're too close to the people, you are not willing to tax because, politics gets very bad. So if you combine all these things, that progressivity you need, you said property, and if property will not be taxed, does it resuscitate the case actually for the center actually being much more proactive on property taxation? And I think that is, would be, one way of thinking about how you combine this with the progressivity challenge. So it's not just this, but also the second and third tier.
So, but, since you mentioned this new point, I think this is just a 30-second interjection. See, there's one very nice paper from China that actually shows, so it goes back to your point about the fiscal compact, right? So people are willing to pay if they see the services in return, but because the state hasn't delivered services, like the taxes are seen as going into this fiscal black hole. But the interesting thing in China is there's actually user charges down at the village level for most basic services. And what you see there's this paper by Nancy Chen and others that, and Gerapatro Miguel, that when you increase decentralization, they actually see that increase in taxes, partly because they conjecture that there is more, because it's the opposite, that there is more say in how the money is spent, and so people seem to be willing to be taxed. So maybe there's some path dependence here in terms of have you been used to paying for any services, but it's an interesting conjecture. So let's take, I think there was a question at the back.
So it's a long-winded answer. You probably wanted to know whether the tax rate is going to come down from X to Y. I'm sorry I gave you a typically convoluted economist answer to that, yeah?
Hello, I'm Rona Joy. I'm a journalist with Bloomberg News. Sir, you
trouble. I smell trouble here.
I hope not. But sir, you mentioned that part of the decline in the rupee was a welcome market adjustment. How do you see that affecting exporters? Could it provide a boost to them? Would the decline need to go on for longer?
Yeah, sure. I'm really happy to cite Sajid Chinoy's paper, which I find very intuitive as well. I think what he finds is that certainly on the export side, the responsiveness of exports to exchange rates is actually quite high and much higher than what we've thought before. And it's also consistent with certain other patterns that we know. For example, the more value added there is in exports, the more responsive it is. So in India, because value added in exports has declined, the responsiveness has also declined over time. But despite that, I think the responsiveness is very high. So I think that in the medium term, obviously there are going to be lags in this, but I think in the medium term, this has to have a positive effect on exports going forward, especially on kind of manufacturing exports. And the other thing that we don't realize is that, these things have a very, remember, this is a very important point that we forget when we discuss the exchange rate, is we often think of manufacturing. Services, Indian IT services are highly value-added intensive. There's more domestic value-added in IT than there is in manufacturing. So the boost that exports can get from exchange rates are probably also going to be very significant.
Okay, we'll take one last question and then wind down. So.
Hi, my name is Harsh Gupta. I'm just wondering, do you think Indian economists, because many of us are trained in the UK or the US, directly or indirectly, have over the last few decades, not just this government or that government, underestimated the demand or the need for transportation infrastructure. And we have always talked about factor markets, land, labor, capital, assuming that a basic functioning state is there. And not just physical infrastructure, but functioning judiciary, basic police per capita numbers, all these things simply because our bias is towards developed market economics, maybe subconsciously.
I should answer that.
Yeah, you please, Karthik, please.
I mean, if anything, I think the IPF, if there's one kind of repeated mantra in the IPF, I think it's exactly that, right? I think I had a paper 2 years ago on exactly this issue of a new approach to public sector staffing that kind of reflects exactly this problem, that, the sinews of the state are essentially broken, and we haven't made that reinvestment in the public institutions. Devesh Kapoor's today comment, on the way forward. So I think, it's certainly been very, very salient over here, but it gives me a great segue on which to end, right? Which is, the time has flown so fast, and Shekhar, apologies, you had to come and sing, but I think in this case, it is partly, I think, all because of Arvind, I kept my share small, but the questions, there's very deep answers, so thank you so much for the engagement. And let me just kind of conclude with, really a heartfelt plea, not just from myself, but I'm sure a lot of others, which is, I think there is, everybody was like, why are you leaving now? And as an academic, I kind of get the need to step back from the franticness and kind of just renew and the thoughts and then, come back and engage. But let me make a just heartfelt plea to stay engaged in two ways, right? One is, even though you don't have the franticness of the day-to-day kind of firefighting and this has to get done by this time, I think if you take on seriously this mantle of kind of being a mentor and shaper of the IES, I think that would be an incredibly valuable legacy. So the CEA is the cadre controlling authority, but there is a certain moral authority that comes from being a former CEA that all the executive ed courses in the world will not do. So you might even be able to work out a setup where a future CEA does the firefighting, and then you continue being involved in an honorary way in kind of doing that mentorship. I think the second plea is, again, we've talked sometimes, about just the importance then of kind of the economic surveys have been these masterful documents. And I think, my personal view is that the impact of those things would be magnified many times if you were to then consider functioning as an honorary CEA to states, where you have a willing CM, kind of willing to kind of, really have this broad-ranging conversation of saying, we are on an unsustainable path, we keep putting band-aids on corpses, MSP increase, all of this, we know it's not sustainable. And if people are getting it, the nice thing about the state-level model is you just need one or two people, who will work with you in a deep, engaged way. And I hope you would consider that, and maybe, this is a call to chief ministers to tap on you, and have you function that way.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Karthik.
Including these investments in state capacity, all of that stuff.
I think that, there's no way that I will not remain engaged and thinking about India all the time. I think I may go out of India, but very difficult to take the India out of me, and I think the finance minister said that as well. And I would be more than happy. I'd be thrilled and delighted. Subject to my grandbaby sitting commitments, which are going to be my wife is shaking her head and saying, he didn't babysit, what's he going to grandbabysit? But I mean, I would love to be, engaged as, I do, for example, one thing that, in fact, now that you've said this to me, Kaushik and Raghu are not here, but we want to create this new training institute. I want the first course on that, or the first set of courses, to be taught by Kaushik, Raghu, and me. So you challenge me, I challenge my predecessors. Kaushik and Raghu, you should come and do this. And I do want, building the IES and capacity is a passion, and I've spent a lot of effort on this. And staying engaged with policy making, either with central or state, I would just be thrilled to do that. So Karthik, when you become CEA, please don't forget me.
Did not acknowledge fully. He is the co-editor of the India Policy Forum. I called him a co-conspirator, but he's much more than that. He's, of course, the Tata Chancellor Chair at University of California, San Diego. I'm really very grateful to Karthik and to Arvind. If there's one thing that this evening has proved, it's that the demand for Arvind Subramanian is going to exceed its supply. And as somebody in Mint put it, the economic consequences of Arvind Subramanian's grandchild can be quite serious. So Parul, please spare him some of the babysitting and the nappy changing. And we really do need Arvind to helicopter in from time to time, whether in state issues or issues at the center. Please join me in giving Arvind a really, I don't want to say a farewell because we are still some months away, weeks away, we don't know, weeks away, but nonetheless, a really warm round of applause for all that he has done. He's also been a great friend of NCAER and the India Policy Forum. He opened last year's India Policy Forum and indeed has also given the India Policy Forum lecture the year before. He's also been a very frequent visitor at something else that we do called the Neemrana Conference and has spoken eloquently there. There's one last duty you have to do, which is to release the volume that we produce as a result of the India Policy Forum, and Karthik, you too as well.
Shekhar, you should come as well.
All right, I should. Okay, I will.
Shekhar, do you want to come in the middle?
This is the Christmas gift we always have, and this is what comes out of the India Policy Forum.